A tiny German Shepherd puppy slept inside a discarded takeout box on a cold Lancaster sidewalk. People passed, some looked down. No one stopped long enough to ask why the puppy refused every piece of food, or why the puppy kept watching for a woman wearing lavender gloves. Then, Daniel Harper, a 44-year-old Navy SEAL preparing to leave town, noticed one small paw reaching for his coat. Why did the puppy refuse to leave the sidewalk? Who was the elderly woman the puppy had been waiting for? And why did a scrap of yellow wool lead Daniel toward a dark house whose porch light had not burned for 3 nights? Daniel believed he was rescuing one abandoned puppy. But was the puppy trying to rescue someone else? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late November settled over Lancaster, Pennsylvania, beneath a low gray sky that made the red brick buildings look older than they were. Cold winds slipped between the market stalls, carrying the smells of roasted coffee, warm bread, damp stone, and fallen leaves beginning to rot along the curbs. Outside Lancaster's Central Market, where vendors called greetings to familiar customers and paper bags rustled beneath gloved hands, a tiny German Shepherd puppy lay curled inside the bottom half of a discarded white foam takeout container. The puppy was no more than 8 weeks old. Black and tan fur covered a body so thin that the small ribs could be felt beneath the damp coat. One ear folded forward while the other tried unsuccessfully to stand, giving the puppy an expression that might have been comical under kinder circumstances. A copper-colored patch marked the front left paw like a tarnished penny. Most passers-by assumed the puppy was sleeping. A few slowed down. One woman whispered, "Poor little thing," before following her husband into the market. A delivery driver placed half a biscuit beside the container. 2 teenagers took a photograph, then hurried away when the wind grew sharper. None of them understood that the puppy was not truly asleep. Beneath the closed eyelids, the puppy listened. Every approaching footstep carried a different rhythm. Heavy work boots struck the pavement with confidence. Children skipped unevenly beside parents. Elderly shoppers moved carefully, heels scraping before each measured step. The puppy waited for one particular sound, the quiet tap of sensible shoes, followed by the faint rustle of a wool coat. For several mornings, a small elderly woman had come to the same place wearing lavender-colored gloves. Silver hair showed beneath her knitted hat, and her narrow shoulders curved slightly forward, not from weakness, but from a lifetime spent leaning closer when others spoke. She always brought pieces of chicken wrapped in wax paper. Before leaving, she rested one lavender glove between the puppy's ears and spoke in a voice as gentle as warm milk. The puppy did not understand the words, but understood their meaning. "I see you. I have not forgotten you." For 3 mornings, however, the lavender gloves had not appeared. The puppy had remained near the foam container because it held the woman's scent. Hunger gnawed through the small belly, yet the biscuit beside the box remained untouched. Food left by strangers carried no promise. The puppy had learned that hands could reach down kindly one moment and shove roughly the next. A child's delighted squeal could be followed by an adult's impatient command to stay away. The street was a kingdom ruled by shoes, wheels, and sudden noises. Survival depended upon knowing which sounds meant danger and which meant patience. The elderly woman's steps had meant patience. On the 3rd morning of her absence, the puppy's strength was beginning to fail. Still, every time footsteps approached from the direction of the market entrance, the small head lifted slightly. Each disappointment ended the same way. The nose lowered onto the copper-marked paw, and the puppy waited again. Across the street, Daniel Harper parked an aging dark blue pickup beside a loading zone and remained behind the wheel longer than necessary. Daniel was 44 years old, a former Navy SEAL with a tall, broad-shouldered frame that still carried the disciplined strength of military service. Short, dark brown hair, touched with gray at both temples, framed a weathered, angular face. A neatly trimmed beard followed the hard line of his jaw, concealing a pale scar beneath his chin. His deep-set gray eyes rarely rested in one place for long. Even in a peaceful street, Daniel noticed open doorways, reflective windows, approaching vehicles, and anyone standing too close behind him. Years of training had taught him to read danger before danger announced itself. Years after leaving the service had failed to teach him how to stop. Daniel was courteous with strangers, dependable when someone needed practical help, and almost impossible to know beyond the surface. He had once believed that surviving difficult things made a man stronger. Lately, he suspected survival sometimes only made a man better at hiding the damaged parts. In the truck bed sat a heavy wooden toolbox that had belonged to Daniel's father. The box was made of dark walnut, scarred at the corners and polished smooth where an older pair of hands had lifted it thousands of times. Inside were planes, chisels, measuring squares, and hammers, arranged with the stubborn precision of a man who had believed every broken thing deserved one honest attempt at repair. Daniel's father had died 18 months earlier. Since then, the tools had remained untouched in Daniel's garage, gathering dust beside unfinished shelves and boards that were never cut. That morning, Daniel intended to take the toolbox to a consignment shop on West King Street. Selling it felt practical. Daniel had become very skilled at calling painful decisions practical. His phone vibrated in the cup holder. The screen showed the name Beth Harper. Beth, Daniel's younger sister, was a slim 40-year-old woman with shoulder-length chestnut hair, pale, freckled skin, and clear green eyes that made dishonesty difficult in her presence. Unlike Daniel, Beth filled silence rather than hiding inside it. She taught elementary school, remembered birthdays without reminders, and possessed the unnerving habit of hearing what people avoided saying. Divorce had forced Beth to raise her daughter largely alone, but hardship had softened her rather than sharpening her. Daniel admired that quality and kept his distance from it. He answered on the fourth vibration. "Mornin'? You still coming for Thanksgiving?" Beth asked. Her tone was casual, but Daniel heard the concern beneath it. "I have a few things to take care of." "You've had a few things to take care of since Labor Day." Daniel looked at the toolbox reflected in the rearview mirror. "I didn't say no." "You rarely do. You just keep delaying until the decision makes itself." A market worker rolled a metal cart past the truck, and Daniel's shoulders tightened at the sudden clatter. "Beth, I'm in the middle of something." There was a brief silence. Beth understood that phrase. It usually meant Daniel was searching for a reason not to be needed. "Dinner is at 4, she said gently. "There will be a place for you whether you arrive at 3:59 or not." After the call ended, Daniel sat with one hand on the steering wheel. Beth's invitations always sounded simple. A chair, a plate, familiar voices. Yet ordinary kindness demanded a kind of courage Daniel no longer trusted himself to possess. In military life, every role had been clear. In civilian rooms, he never knew where to put his hands, what stories could safely be told, or why laughter sometimes made him feel more alone. Then Daniel noticed the foam container across the street. At first he thought the dark shape inside was a discarded coat. Then one small ear moved. Daniel crossed the street, crouched several feet away, and studied the puppy without reaching forward. The German shepherd's fur was wet along the belly and clumped around the hind legs. The tiny body trembled despite being curled tightly for warmth. Daniel bought a packet of sliced turkey from a nearby vendor, tore off a small piece, and placed it beside the container. The puppy opened tired brown eyes, smelled the food, and turned away. "You're either stubborn," Daniel murmured, "or waiting for something better." The puppy lifted the head at the sound of his voice, but did not eat. Daniel knew enough about frightened animals not to force contact. Someone else would stop, he told himself. A market employee would call a shelter. The city had systems for such things. Daniel had spent years believing systems worked best when individuals stayed within their assigned roles. He stood and walked toward his truck. Behind him came the faint scrape of claws against pavement. Daniel looked down.
The puppy had struggled out of the container and crossed the short distance on shaking legs. The copper-marked paw was hooked weakly into the hem of Daniel's jeans. The grip had almost no strength, yet the puppy held on as though that scrap of fabric were the final fixed object in a moving world. Daniel stared at the small paw.
Something inside him, something carefully packed away beside grief, duty, and his father's unused tools, shifted out of place. "All right," he whispered. He bent and lifted the puppy against his chest. The little body was colder and lighter than he expected. Beneath the place where the puppy had been curled, Daniel noticed a torn strip of pale yellow wool pressed into the foam container. He picked it up. The fabric carried dirt, the faint scent of chicken, and a soft trace of lavender. As Daniel carried the puppy toward the truck, the puppy did not look back at the box. The puppy looked past Daniel's shoulder toward the long market street, watching the empty sidewalk as though someone important had simply been delayed and might still be trying to come home. The afternoon darkened early over Lancaster, and a thin rain began tapping against the windshield as Daniel Harper drove away from the market with the German Shepherd puppy wrapped inside his old canvas jacket. The small animal rested on the passenger seat, trembling beneath the fabric, but the tired brown eyes remained fixed on the pale yellow strip of wool Daniel had placed beside her. Every few minutes, the puppy stretched her neck to smell it, as though the fading trace of lavender mattered more than the unfamiliar man, the moving truck, or even the hunger tightening her belly. Daniel kept one hand on the steering wheel, and the other close enough to prevent the puppy from sliding when he turned. He told himself that he was simply delivering a stray animal to someone qualified. It was a clean, temporary responsibility with an obvious ending. Those were the kinds of problems Daniel preferred. A frightened puppy could be examined, fed, and handed over. A dead father's tools, an empty house, and a Thanksgiving invitation from a sister who understood him too well were less cooperative. Bennett Veterinary Clinic occupied the first floor of a narrow brick building near the edge of the historic district. Warm yellow light spilled across the wet sidewalk, and a painted wooden sign above the entrance showed a dog and cat sitting beneath the same umbrella. Daniel carried the puppy inside, where the air smelled of disinfectant, clean blankets, and the faint, nervous musk of animals. The veterinarian who emerged from the examination room was Dr. Laura Bennett, a 46-year-old woman of medium height with a sturdy, capable build and warm brown skin. Her thick black hair, threaded with a few silver strands, was pulled into a practical knot at the nape of her neck. Rectangular glasses framed dark, observant eyes that missed very little, though her quiet voice made worried owners feel that nothing terrible would happen without warning. Laura had opened the clinic after spending years in emergency veterinary medicine, a profession that had taught her to move quickly without making fear move faster. She wore navy blue scrubs beneath a gray cardigan and carried herself with the calm authority of someone accustomed to receiving frightened creatures from equally frightened people. "You found her like this?" Laura asked as Daniel placed the puppy on a padded examination table. "In a takeout container outside the market." Laura's expression tightened for only a moment before professional focus returned. She ran careful fingers along the puppy's spine, checked the gums, listened to the chest, and examined the copper-marked front paw. The puppy flinched when Laura touched a shallow cut between the pads, but did not snap or growl. Instead, she turned her head toward Daniel and searched his face. "She's dehydrated and underweight," Laura said. "Probably 8 weeks old, perhaps a little younger. The paw is irritated, but the wound is small and clean enough to treat here. No fever, no serious respiratory trouble, and her heart sounds strong." Daniel exhaled without realizing he had been holding his breath. "So she'll be fine. With proper care, most likely. That is not the same as saying she is fine now." Laura gave the puppy warmed fluids beneath the skin, cleaned the injured paw, and offered a spoonful of soft food. At first the puppy turned away just as she had on the sidewalk. Laura waited rather than pushing the bowl closer. Daniel sat on a low stool, broad shoulders filling the narrow corner, while the puppy watched him with wary concentration. After several minutes, Daniel tore off a tiny portion, held it near the puppy's nose, and placed it on the table. The puppy ate. The next bite disappeared more quickly. Laura glanced at the copper patch on the puppy's paw. She needs something better than the dog while she is here. She isn't staying with me. That was not the question. Daniel looked down at the little paw. Penny, then. Laura smiled. Penny it is. A scanner passed over Penny's shoulders and neck without producing a sound. There was no microchip, no collar mark, and no missing dog report matching her description. Laura checked several local shelter notices and neighborhood pages, but found nothing. Daniel felt an unexpected irritation at the absence. Somewhere, someone should have been searching. The lack of a name seemed worse than the lack of a collar, as though Penny had entered the world without anyone agreeing to remember her. Laura wrapped the paw in a narrow blue bandage. She should not go to a shelter tonight if it can be avoided. The kennels are full and she is exhausted. I can keep her for a few days, Daniel said. Only until you find somewhere suitable. Of course, Laura replied with such neutrality that Daniel suspected she did not believe him. While preparing a bag of puppy food and written instructions, Laura noticed the strip of yellow wool protruding from Daniel's jacket pocket. He explained where he had found it and described the elderly woman with lavender gloves. Laura took the fabric, smelled it lightly, and her expression changed. Lavender hand cream, she said. A lot of the older women around Maple Street use it. There is a volunteer group there called the Porch Light Circle. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Nothing official, Laura continued. A few widows and retired neighbors started checking on people who live alone. Each evening they make sure porch lights are switched on. If a light stays dark, somebody calls or knocks. They deliver groceries, replace batteries, sometimes just sit and talk. Sounds useful. It was. The woman who coordinated it has not been seen for several days. Without her, the calls have become irregular. Daniel accepted the food bag but showed little interest. Lancaster contained many elderly women and many lavender-scented products. Connecting one torn piece of wool to a missing volunteer seemed like the kind of hopeful theory people invented when uncertainty made them uncomfortable. Then Laura said, The organizer always wore lavender gloves in cold weather. Penny's head rose sharply from the blanket. The tired ears shifted forward, and the puppy stared at Laura. When Laura repeated the word lavender, Penny struggled to stand. Daniel noticed, so did Laura. Neither spoke for a moment. By early evening, Daniel had bought more supplies than he intended: a small padded bed, 2 stainless steel bowls, a soft gray blanket, puppy pads, a chew toy shaped like a carrot, and a bag of treats recommended by a store clerk who addressed Penny as though they were already old friends. Daniel's house stood on a quiet street west of the city center. A modest 2-story home with plain white walls and furniture arranged more for order than comfort. The silence inside had grown heavier since his father's death. Penny entered cautiously, smelling each doorway and pausing whenever the heating pipes knocked in the walls. Daniel placed the new bed near the living room radiator. Penny inspected it, stepped inside once, and immediately climbed out. She found the pale yellow wool on the coffee table, caught one end carefully between her teeth, and dragged it toward the front door. Then she curled herself across Daniel's worn leather boots, resting her nose on the fabric. "You have a bed," Daniel told her. Penny closed her eyes. "That cost $40. One ear twitched, but the puppy did not move. Daniel almost smiled. The expression felt unfamiliar enough that he looked away. Later that night, rain gave way to hard wind. Daniel slept badly. In his dream, the darkness was filled with dust, shouted instructions, and a doorway he could not reach in time. He woke sitting upright on the sofa, one fist clenched, breath coming too quickly. For several seconds, he did not recognize his own living room. The old military instinct told him to stand, assess the exits, and control the space. Another part of him knew there was no danger. Yet knowledge and feeling rarely obeyed the same chain of command. Penny had awakened beneath his boots. She approached slowly, limping slightly on the bandaged paw. She did not bark, retreat, or climb onto him. The puppy simply placed the copper-marked paw against Daniel's wrist and remained there. Daniel stared at the tiny foot resting over the pulse he could not calm. Penny's warmth passed through his skin. Gradually, his breathing slowed. The room returned. The radiator ticking, rain against glass, a gray blanket abandoned beside an expensive, empty bed. Near dawn, Daniel woke again to a soft whine. Penny stood at the front door with a pale yellow strip of wool held gently in her mouth. Her body was still weak, but her attention was sharp and urgent. She looked at Daniel, then at the door, then back at him. Daniel understood at last that Penny was not trying to escape the stranger's house. She was asking the stranger to follow her. Dawn came pale and brittle over Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with frost silvering the parked cars and turning the bare branches along the sidewalks into thin black veins against the winter sky. The rain had passed during the night, leaving the streets damp and shining, while a cold wind moved through the brick neighborhoods west of the market. Daniel Harper opened his front door, expecting Penny to hesitate. Instead, the 8-week-old German Shepherd puppy stepped over the threshold with a strip of pale yellow wool clenched between her small teeth. The blue bandage around her copper-marked paw made her gait uneven, but her purpose seemed stronger than her weakened body. Penny lowered her nose to the pavement, inhaled deeply, and pulled toward the east. Daniel had fastened a lightweight leash to the temporary collar he had bought the previous evening. He had expected to guide the puppy. Within minutes he realized Penny intended to guide him. They moved slowly through the waking city. Delivery trucks idled beside bakeries, shopkeepers raised metal shutters, and early customers carried coffee beneath scarves pulled high around their faces. Penny paused often, sorting through the invisible world of scents beneath the sharper smells of wet pavement, chimney smoke, and fallen leaves. Each time Daniel thought the trail had disappeared, the puppy returned to the yellow wool, smelled it, and continued. Daniel followed with the guarded patience that had once carried him through unfamiliar terrain. Yet this search felt unlike any mission he had known. There were no coordinates, no briefing, and no certainty that the woman with lavender gloves was truly in danger. There was only a small dog limping forward, as if loyalty itself could become a compass. Daniel tried to remain practical. Penny might simply remember a place where she had once been fed. The woman could be visiting relatives. She could have changed her routine. There were a dozen harmless explanations, and Daniel repeated them silently because harmless explanations were easier to carry. Still, he could not ignore the image of Penny waiting for 3 mornings in the foam box, conserving what little strength remained because one person had failed to return. People often called animals simple, Daniel thought, but there was nothing simple about waiting when hunger offered every reason to leave. Maple Street began several blocks north of the market. It was a narrow residential road lined with attached red brick houses, shallow front gardens, and concrete steps polished by generations of shoes. Bare maple trees leaned over the street, their last brown leaves caught against iron fences. Most porches were decorated for the approaching Thanksgiving holiday. Small wreaths hung from doors, ceramic pumpkins sat beside flower pots, and warm lamps glowed behind lace curtains. Penny ignored each house until she reached the middle of the block. Then she stopped. The house before them was narrower than the others, with white-trimmed windows and a faded blue door. A brass number hung crookedly above the mail slot. Unlike the neighboring homes, no wreath decorated the entrance. The porch light remained dark despite the gloomy morning, and 3 newspapers lay inside the small iron gate, their pages swollen from the previous night's rain. Penny gave one sharp pull on the leash and climbed the steps. "Easy," Daniel said, though the word was meant as much for himself as for the puppy. Penny pressed her nose beneath the blue door, inhaled, then whined. She scratched at the wood with her uninjured paw. When nothing happened, she hurried along the narrow side passage toward the back of the house. Daniel followed, his unease hardening into a tension. The rear garden was enclosed by a low wooden fence. Dead tomato vines sagged over a trellis, and an overturned watering can lay beside the steps. Penny climbed onto the lowest step and scratched at the back door. Then she raised her muzzle and made a sound Daniel had not heard from her before. It was not a bark. It was not the frightened cry of an injured animal. It was a long, trembling call filled with recognition and urgency. A neighboring door opened. An elderly woman stepped outside wearing a burgundy housecoat beneath a heavy tan cardigan. She was Ruth Walker, 73 years old, with a short, rounded figure, soft brown skin, and tightly curled silver-gray hair cropped close around her face. Thick glasses enlarged her dark eyes, which were kind but habitually worried. Ruth had spent 36 years working as a hospital receptionist, a job that had taught her to notice when frightened people disguised fear as irritation. Since her husband's death 4 years earlier, she had become more attentive to other people's silences, partly because she knew how loud an empty home could become.
"What are you doing at Maggie's door?"
Ruth asked. Her voice held caution rather than accusation. Daniel showed her the yellow wool and briefly explained where he had found Penny. Ruth's gaze dropped to the puppy. Her hand flew to her mouth. "That little dog," she whispered. "Maggie told me about her." "Is Maggie the woman with lavender gloves?" Ruth nodded quickly. "Margaret Collins. Everyone calls her Maggie. 78 years old, retired school teacher. Small woman, white hair cut to her chin, always neat as Sunday morning even when she's taking out the trash. She taught second grade for nearly 40 years. She can persuade a stubborn child, a frightened widow, or a broken furnace repairman to behave sensibly without ever raising her voice." "When did you last see her?" Ruth looked toward the dark porch lamp. 3 nights ago. She brought soup to Mr. Leonard at the end of the street. "I thought she had gone to stay with her niece, but she would have told me." "Have you called?" "Every day. No answer." Shame crossed Ruth's face. "I should have checked sooner." Daniel recognized that kind of guilt, the belief that knowing more afterward meant one should somehow have known sooner. "You checked now," he said. "Do you have a key?" Ruth did not. Daniel knocked hard on the rear door and called Maggie's name. No response came from inside. He moved to the window, shaded his eyes, and looked through the glass. The kitchen appeared orderly. A mug sat on the table beside a folded newspaper. Beyond the kitchen, the hallway disappeared into shadow. Daniel called emergency services. While they waited, Penny continued scratching and calling. Ruth stood beside the fence, twisting the edge of her cardigan between her fingers. She explained that Maggie had organized the porch light circle after an elderly neighbor spent 2 days alone with a broken ankle. The system was simple. Each person turned on a porch light by early evening. If a light remained dark, someone called. If the call went unanswered, someone knocked. "Maggie kept a list," Ruth said. "Names, medicines, relatives, spare key information. She never trusted phones to remember what paper could hold." "Where is the list?" "I don't know. She carried a notebook sometimes, but none of us knew where she kept it at home." A police cruiser and ambulance arrived within minutes. A compact female officer in her 30s, with a square jaw and dark hair pulled beneath her cap, listened to Daniel and Ruth before circling the property. After repeated knocking produced no response, the officer identified a rear window whose old wooden latch had not fully caught. Because the accumulating newspapers, unanswered calls, and Penny's behavior suggested an emergency, she authorized entry. Daniel lifted the stiff sash while the officer steadied it, then climbed through at her direction and unlocked the rear door from inside. The house smelled faintly of lavender, old books, and something left cooking too long. Penny pulled free of Ruth's gentle hold and ran inside before anyone could stop her. Daniel followed the sound of her claws across the wooden floor. Margaret Maggie Collins lay beside the bottom of the staircase. She was a slight, 78-year-old woman with pale skin, delicate features, and chin-length white hair flattened on one side. A lavender cardigan covered a cream blouse, and one bare hand rested near a fallen pair of purple gloves. Her face was drained of color, but her eyes opened when Penny reached her. The puppy lowered herself beside Maggie's arm and pressed her narrow body against it. Maggie's fingers moved weakly through the black and tan fur. Paramedics entered and assessed her. Maggie was conscious but dehydrated, bruised and too weak to stand after falling near the stairs several days earlier. As they prepared the stretcher, Daniel noticed a small table beside the hallway telephone. A black notebook lay beneath a pair of reading glasses. He opened it only after the officer asked whether it might contain emergency contacts. The last page listed 12 elderly residents. Beside each name, Maggie had written brief notes in careful blue ink. Does not hear the doorbell. Wednesday, medication, please remind. Daughter lives in Ohio. Likes company with tea, even when she claims she is busy. Daniel stared at the page. These were not administrative notes. They were small maps of human vulnerability, written by someone who had made it her duty to notice what others missed. The paramedics rolled Maggie toward the front door. Penny followed so closely that Daniel had to lift her away from the wheels. Before the stretcher crossed the threshold, Maggie reached out and caught Daniel's hand. Her grip was faint, but her light blue eyes remained clear. She waited for me, didn't she? Maggie whispered. Daniel looked down at Penny, who strained toward the stretcher with the yellow wool still near her bandaged paw. For the first time in years, Daniel knew exactly what he needed to do the next day. Morning light entered Lancaster General Hospital in pale winter bands, touching the polished floor without warming it. Outside, cold wind pushed clouds over the city. Inside Maggie Collins's room, the air smelled of clean linen, weak coffee, and lavender hand cream. Maggie sat against two pillows, smaller than Daniel remembered, but more alert, her chin-length white hair neatly combed, and her pale blue eyes bright with embarrassment at being watched. A bruise darkened one temple. Penny lay beside Daniel's chair, the blue bandage still wrapped around her copper-marked paw. Whenever Maggie moved, the puppy's head lifted at once. Maggie explained that Penny had appeared near the market after a violent rainstorm nearly 2 weeks earlier. Water had rushed along the curb, and the puppy had been hiding beneath a vegetable cart, shaking so hard her teeth clicked. Maggie offered chicken, but Penny approached only after the older woman sat on the pavement and turned her face away. Frightened creatures sometimes need the dignity of making the first move, Maggie said. She had fed Penny every morning and intended to take her to Dr. Laura Bennett. Yet every attempt to carry her away ended the same way. Penny slipped free, returned to the foam container, and curled around the strip of yellow wool. It was as though she believed someone had left a promise there, Maggie said. If she abandoned the box, the promise might not find her. Daniel looked down at Penny. She waited for you, and nearly died doing it. Guilt crossed Maggie's face. She had spent years noticing when others needed help, and knowing Penny had waited through hunger wounded her more than the fall. Will you keep her until I come home? For a few days. Maggie gave him a knowing look. Men often add a time limit when affection frightens them. Maggie then asked about the black notebook found beneath her telephone. Ruth had brought it to the hospital, but Maggie was too weak to make the calls herself. She asked Daniel to check the names until she returned. He hesitated. The notes felt private. Medications, hearing problems, distant children, favorite tea. Maggie read his concern. The list is not a collection of secrets, she said. It is a record of people who should not disappear quietly. By noon, Daniel was home with Penny and the notebook on the kitchen table. Each time he opened it, Penny left the padded bed she still refused to use and sat beside the front door. The first time, Daniel assumed coincidence. The second time, Penny brought the yellow wool. By the third, she released a soft, impatient huff. Before Daniel made the first call, Beth arrived, carrying a casserole and groceries. Her daughter Emma followed with a laptop under one arm. Emma Harper was 15, tall and long-limbed, with light brown skin, dark chestnut curls, hazel eyes behind round black glasses, and a thin silver brace that flashed when she smiled. Quieter than her mother, Emma observed before speaking. Watching Beth manage work, bills, and single parenthood had made the teenager practical beyond her years. She preferred problems that could be organized into columns. Beth surveyed the kitchen, noticing the puppy food, veterinary instructions, and the wooden toolbox now resting inside the mudroom instead of in Daniel's truck. She did not ask whether he still planned to leave Lancaster. Her silence told him she had noticed he was no longer talking about it. Emma opened the notebook. "This needs a tracker." "It needs a few calls," Daniel replied. "It has 12 names." Within 20 minutes, Emma had created a table with columns for name, address, time called, response, and follow-up. Beth copied phone numbers onto index cards while Daniel stood at the counter, feeling as though his quiet house had been occupied by an efficient committee. Penny sat beneath the table, chewing the carrot-shaped toy she had ignored the night before. The first person answered on the second ring and repeatedly called Daniel David. The second insisted his porch light was already on even though it was barely afternoon. The third spoke for 10 minutes about the weather, describing every cloud over Maple Street as if reporting troop movements. Daniel listened longer than he expected. The fourth caller was an elderly woman who claimed her toaster had developed hostile intentions. It burned one side of the bread, left the other pale, and ejected slices whenever she turned away. Daniel suggested a failing heating element. She lowered her voice and replied, "That is exactly what it wants you to think." Emma covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Even Daniel smiled. The fifth person was visiting a son in Harrisburg. The sixth answered only after Beth noticed Maggie's note. "Moves slowly, do not give up." An elderly man finally picked up, breathless but cheerful, and thanked them for remembering him. Then Daniel dialed the seventh number. The telephone rang until the line disconnected. He tried again. No answer. Emma marked the row in yellow. Beth read the note beside the entry. "Lives alone, radio usually on, porch light by 4. Daniel looked outside. Afternoon was fading. Address? Penny reached the front door before Beth finished reading it. They drove to a narrow street several blocks beyond Maple. Beth and Emma remained in the truck while Daniel approached with Penny. The seventh house had a shallow porch, peeling white rails and drawn curtains. Its porch light was dark. Behind the door, an old radio program played, cheerful voices laughing for an unseen audience. Daniel knocked. No answer. Penny pressed her nose to the gap beneath the door, inhaled, and barked 3 short times. Daniel knocked again, harder. "My name is Daniel Harper. Maggie Collins asked me to check on you." For several seconds only the radio replied. Then, from somewhere beyond the locked door, a weak voice answered. Late afternoon settled over the quiet street, beneath a sky the color of old pewter. The wind had sharpened since Daniel and Penny left his house, sending dry leaves scraping along the curb and pressing cold air through the seams of Daniel's coat. Inside the seventh house, the radio continued playing a cheerful comedy program, its canned laughter spilling through the locked door while the weak voice behind it called, "I'm coming! I'm not dead! I'm simply slower than people with younger knees." Daniel stepped back from the porch as the deadbolt turned. The door opened to reveal Evelyn Carter, an 81-year-old widow with a small, bird-like frame, warm beige skin, and a cloud of white hair pinned loosely above her neck. She wore a pale blue cardigan over a flowered house dress and thick gray socks that did not match. Her face was finely lined, but her dark eyes remained quick and mischievous. Evelyn had spent 54 years married to a railroad clerk who believed every household problem could be solved with either oil or patience. Since his death, she had guarded her independence with fierce humor, treating concern from others as something to be accepted only after a suitable amount of resistance. "You've nearly frightened 10 years off my life," Evelyn told Daniel. "I called twice and knocked 3 times. "That explains nothing. I couldn't hear any of it." Evelyn pointed toward the living room where a high-backed chair sat beneath a crocheted blanket. Her hearing aid had slipped behind it earlier that morning. Without it, the telephone became a silent decoration, and the doorbell little more than an optimistic light on the wall. Daniel entered cautiously while Penny pushed past his boots and began sniffing around the chair.
The puppy's bandaged paw made her movements slightly uneven, yet her curiosity had recovered faster than her strength.
Evelyn bent as far as her back allowed and studied the small German shepherd.
"Well," she said, "that is either a puppy or a dust mop with opinions."
Penny squeezed beneath the chair. A moment later, she backed out with something silver between her teeth. Daniel crouched, expecting the missing hearing aid. Penny dropped a teaspoon onto the carpet. She returned beneath the chair and emerged with one striped sock, then another, then a third that belonged to no visible pair. Evelyn watched in growing astonishment. On the fourth trip, Penny dragged out a television remote covered in dust. Evelyn pressed both hands to her chest.
"I have been accusing my nephew of losing that for 6 months."
Daniel looked toward the radio. "Should we call and clear his name?"
"Not yet. It keeps him humble."
The hearing aid appeared on Penny's final trip, tucked gently between her teeth. Evelyn laughed so hard she had to sit down. The tension that had filled the doorway disappeared, and Daniel felt his own shoulders loosen. He cleaned the device with a tissue before handing it over. Once Evelyn could hear properly, she explained that Maggie called every evening before supper. Without Maggie's voice, the day had felt strangely unfinished, but Evelyn had assumed the retired teacher was visiting family. Daniel examined the porch fixture before leaving. The bulb had burned out, and the socket was loose. He replaced the bulb from Evelyn's utility drawer and tightened the fitting with a screwdriver borrowed from her kitchen junk box. When the porch light came on, Evelyn stood behind the screen door and looked at it longer than the simple repair deserved.
"Funny thing about a light," she said softly. "You don't miss it while the sun is up."
The words stayed with Daniel as he returned to Maple Street. Over the next several days, the calls from Maggie's notebook became visits. Ruth Walker's front handrail had loosened where 2 screws had pulled free from the brick. Ruth had avoided mentioning it because she feared someone would insist she stop using the steps alone. Daniel replaced the damaged anchors and added a second support point. Ruth stood nearby in a plum-colored coat, offering advice that arrived approximately 3 seconds after each task was completed. Penny sat beside Daniel's toolbox with such solemn concentration that Ruth named her the four-legged inspector. The title followed Penny from house to house. At the home of Helen Morris, a 76-year-old retired nurse, Daniel repaired a swollen wooden door that stuck whenever the weather turned damp. Helen was tall and narrow, with copper-brown skin, close-cut gray hair, and long hands that still moved with the precision of someone accustomed to preparing bandages. Years of hospital work had made her direct but not unkind. She distrusted fussing and regarded discomfort as information rather than tragedy. While Daniel planed the edge of the door, Helen checked Penny's healing paw and declared the veterinary wrap acceptable, though slightly theatrical. Another stop belonged to June Whitaker, an 84-year-old woman with rosy cheeks, silver curls, and a round face that seemed permanently on the verge of amusement. June kept wrapped butter cookies in every coat pocket because, as she explained, you never know when a child, a neighbor, or a respectable dog will require immediate encouragement. Her doorbell worked only when pressed from one particular angle. Daniel replaced the cracked button while June fed Penny crumbs despite repeated warnings that the puppy had proper treats. By the time Daniel finished, Penny had stolen one of June's knitted gloves and was carrying it proudly around the porch. "Inspector's fee," June said. House by house, the porch light circle began to breathe again. Daniel replaced bulbs, tightened hinges, adjusted latches, checked smoke alarms, and repaired one kitchen drawer that had been tied shut with a shoelace in spring. The jobs were small. None required the discipline, speed, or physical courage that had once defined his usefulness. Yet every completed repair changed something more than wood or metal. A widow could ascend her steps without fear. A retired nurse could close her door against the cold. An elderly woman could hear a visitor before the visitor gave up and left. Daniel had spent years believing value came from being needed during emergencies. He had never considered the quieter value of preventing small dangers from becoming large ones. For the first 2 visits, he used a cheap plastic toolkit from the hardware store.
On the third morning, he stood in his garage before the dark walnut box that had belonged to his father. Dust covered the lid. The familiar scratches along the corners seemed almost accusatory. Daniel had avoided opening it because the tools carried not only his father's memory, but also his father's unfinished expectations. His father had been a broad-handed carpenter with iron-gray hair, a patient temperament, and a habit of answering emotional problems with practical work. After Daniel returned from service, quieter and harder to reach, the older man never demanded explanations. He simply invited Daniel into the workshop and handed him something loose, cracked, or unfinished. Daniel lifted the lid. Inside, the planes, chisels, squares, and hammers remained arranged exactly as his father had left them. Beneath a folding ruler lay a small piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. Daniel recognized the firm, slanted handwriting. "A house does not have to be perfect. It only needs someone willing to repair what has come loose." Daniel read the sentence twice. His father had probably written it about a job, a customer, or a stubborn old staircase. Yet standing there with Penny chewing sawdust from the floor, Daniel understood that the words had never belonged only to wood and nails. At the rear of the garage stood his father's old workshop, separated by a sliding door. Daniel had planned to sell the building along with the tools before winter deepened. A white "for sale" sign remained taped inside the front window, facing the street like a decision waiting to be completed. Daniel carried the walnut toolbox inside. He opened the shutters, swept the workbench, and ran one hand along the scarred surface. Penny wandered through the thin layer of sawdust, sneezed twice, then lowered herself into the warm patch of sunlight beneath the bench. Daniel crossed to the window and peeled away the sign. The tape resisted, tearing one corner before finally releasing. He folded the paper once and placed it in the trash. Penny watched him from the floor, black and tan fur dusted gold by sawdust. Daniel set his father's toolbox on the bench. "Well," he said, hearing the unfamiliar warmth in his own voice, "I suppose this is our workshop now." Early December arrived in Lancaster with a hard, blue sky, brittle sunshine, and frost clinging to the iron railings along Maple Street. Maggie Collins was strong enough to leave the hospital, but not yet strong enough to return home safely. The hospital social worker, Claire Donnelly, explained this to Daniel beside Maggie's bed. Claire was a 52-year-old woman with a compact build, fair skin, short auburn hair, and thoughtful gray eyes. She dressed in practical dark trousers and soft sweaters, and spoke with the steady patience of someone accustomed to telling proud people what they did not want to hear. Years of helping older patients return to homes built before modern safety standards had taught Claire that independence was not preserved by pretending risks did not exist. "The lower stair rail has pulled away from the wall," she said. "The basement steps need better lighting, and the bathroom needs a support bar." "Maggie can go home when those things are repaired." Maggie folded her thin arms across her lavender cardigan. "My house has behaved perfectly well for 43 years. Claire smiled. "Your house did not fall. You did." Maggie looked toward Daniel as if requesting military intervention. Daniel wisely studied the floor. Penny, now healthier and noticeably rounder through the belly, rested beneath Maggie's chair. Both ears were beginning to rise, though the left one still tilted sideways whenever she became tired. Maggie reached down and scratched beneath the puppy's chin. "Apparently everyone in this room has joined forces against me." "Not Penny," Daniel said. Penny immediately stole the corner of Maggie's blanket. "I withdraw that statement." Daniel organized the repairs for Saturday. He expected Ruth Walker and perhaps Beth to help. Instead, half the porch light circle arrived before 9 in the morning. Ruth carried a large pot of coffee and gave instructions before removing her coat. Evelyn Carter brought a walnut pie and announced that she had come strictly as a supervisor because people over 80 should never be trusted with ladders or unsupervised pastry. Helen Morris appeared with a first aid kit large enough for a small emergency room. June Whitaker arrived wearing a green wool coat with cookies in both pockets and 3 extra pairs of gloves because she had correctly predicted Penny would steal at least one.
Beth brought sandwiches, while Emma arrived with printed task sheets and colored labels for each room. Daniel stood in Maggie's hallway with his father's walnut toolbox at his feet and looked at the gathering. He had planned a quiet repair job. What he had received was a community invasion conducted with baked goods. The work began with the staircase. Daniel removed the loosened rail, found the wall studs, and installed stronger brackets. Ruth held the flashlight, but repeatedly pointed it at his face while explaining how her late husband would have approached the problem. Helen measured the basement steps and corrected Emma's labels from dangerous to requires modification, insisting that language affected morale. Evelyn sat near the front window, wrapped in a knitted shawl, reading instructions from a home repair booklet upside down and confidently criticizing everyone's technique. Penny moved among them like a tiny foreman. The blue bandage was gone, and the healed, copper-marked paw carried her from room to room with growing confidence. She sat beside Daniel's toolbox whenever he worked, watching each hammer strike with grave concentration. Unfortunately, her understanding of useful equipment remained imperfect. She carried a paintbrush into the kitchen, brought Daniel a wooden spoon when he requested a screwdriver, and dragged one of June's gloves beneath the dining table. "That is the third glove this week," June said proudly. "You sound pleased," Beth replied. "A dog must have hobbies." By midday, the house smelled of sawdust, coffee, warm pie, and the faint lavender scent that seemed woven into Maggie's curtains. The new rail was secure. Brighter lights had been installed above the basement stairs. Daniel mounted a support bar beside the bathroom tub, while Emma checked each completed task on her list. The repairs were serious, but laughter kept entering the rooms through open doorways. Daniel found himself listening to it with an unfamiliar ache. His father's workshop had once sounded like this when neighbors stopped by, tools striking wood, coffee being poured, several conversations overlapping, and someone laughing from a room away. Daniel had forgotten that work could bind people together rather than merely exhaust them. Yet beneath the warmth of the day, another feeling had begun to trouble him. Whenever Penny disappeared from view, Daniel's attention snapped toward the last place he had seen her. If she remained in another room too long, his chest tightened. When a metal tray fell in the kitchen, Daniel was on his feet before the sound finished, searching for Penny. She was safely beneath the table, chewing a strip of cardboard while Evelyn defended her innocence. "You look more frightened than the dog," Evelyn observed. "I'm checking for broken glass." "There is no glass on a metal tray." Daniel returned to work, but Evelyn's comment followed him. That evening, after everyone had gone and Maggie's house stood ready for her return, Daniel sat alone in his kitchen. Penny slept beneath his chair, one paw resting against his boot. He realized he had begun arranging his days around the puppy's presence. He slept more easily when he could hear her breathing. He entered crowded rooms because Penny entered first. When memories pulled him away from the present, he searched for the warmth of her body against his leg. Penny had helped him, but Daniel feared he had quietly assigned her a duty she had never chosen. She was still a puppy. She deserved to chase leaves, chew expensive furniture, and grow without believing that a grown man's peace depended upon her remaining within reach. The next afternoon, Laura Bennett called and asked Daniel to visit the clinic. Waiting beside her was Samuel Reed, a 57-year-old therapy dog trainer with a lean frame, medium brown skin, close-cropped silver hair, and a neatly shaped gray beard. His calm hazel eyes and measured movements reflected 20 years spent training dogs around people carrying grief, illness, or trauma. Samuel had once worked as a paramedic, but after losing a long-time partner to illness, he had learned how easily helpers could confuse being needed with being healed. "Penny can support you," Samuel said after watching the puppy explore the room. "But she cannot be responsible for keeping you steady every hour of every day." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I never said she was." "You did not have to." Laura remained beside the examination table, her expression kind but direct.
She explained that companionship was healthy, but dependence became unfair when an animal was expected to notice every change in a person's emotional state without rest or training. Samuel invited Daniel to a weekly veterans support group held at a community center near the clinic. Some members attended with trained dogs, others came alone. "The point," Samuel said, "is not to replace the bond with Penny. The point is to make sure she is not the only bridge you have left." Daniel looked at Penny. She had discovered a tennis ball beneath a chair and was attempting to carry it, despite the ball being nearly as wide as her mouth. For once, she was not watching him.
She was simply being young. That night, Daniel downloaded an adoption application from a local German Shepherd rescue. He filled in nothing. He only placed the blank pages on the kitchen table and stared at them. Penny did not tear the paper, bark at it, or perform some perfect act that made the answer easy. She curled beside Daniel's chair, rested her chin on his boot, and waited without knowing what decision stood above her. Daniel understood then that Penny had given him a door back into the world, but she could not walk through it for him. The first snow of the season came gently to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, drifting through the early December morning like white feathers released from an unseen hand. It softened the roofs along Maple Street, gathered on the ironed fences, and covered the cracks in the pavement without pretending they were no longer there. For Daniel Harper, the weeks since placing the adoption application on his kitchen table had been less graceful. Change had not arrived as a single brave decision. It came through uncomfortable conversations, repeated exercises, missed sleep, and the stubborn discovery that asking for help felt offering it. The adoption form remained blank inside a kitchen drawer. Daniel had not destroyed it, but he no longer looked at it whenever fear told him Penny would be safer with someone else. Instead, he began attending the veterans support group Samuel Reed had recommended. The meetings were held every Thursday evening in a plain community room behind a neighborhood library. Folding chairs formed a circle beneath fluorescent lights, and a dented coffee urn produced a drink strong enough to remove paint. Daniel sat near the exit during his first meeting. Penny was not allowed to attend because she had not completed her training, and without her beside him, every movement in the room seemed louder. Samuel did not force Daniel to speak. Neither did Owen Price, a 48-year-old former Army medic who sat 2 chairs away. Owen was a stocky man with broad hands, medium brown skin, a shaved head, and a short black beard beginning to gray around the mouth. His left leg had been amputated below the knee after an explosion overseas, but he moved with an efficient metal prosthesis and disliked anyone treating him as fragile. Owen's humor was dry, his patience hard-earned, and his habit of speaking plainly had grown from years of watching wounded people waste strength pretending nothing hurt. At the end of the meeting, Owen asked, "You planning to sit beside that door forever?" "Maybe." "Good seat," Owen said. "Terrible life strategy." Daniel almost left without answering. Instead, he gave Owen his telephone number. Therapy did not make Daniel peaceful overnight. Some mornings he still woke with his heart racing before his mind understood where he was. But he stopped telling Beth he was fine when he was not. Once, after a difficult night, he called her before sunrise. "I don't need you to fix anything," he said. Beth's voice was sleepy but steady. "That may be the most encouraging sentence you've said in 10 years. On another evening, when Penny was staying at Laura Bennett's clinic for several hours of observation after a vaccination, Daniel felt the old pressure building beneath his ribs. He called Owen instead of driving to the clinic early. Owen listened, then said, "She's safe. You're uncomfortable. Those are not the same emergency." Daniel disliked the sentence because it was true. Samuel began teaching Daniel how to train Penny without turning her into a guardian responsible for every change in his breathing. Penny learned to sit before crossing a doorway, wait for food, follow a hand signal, and settle on a small mat while Daniel moved around the room. She performed beautifully when treats were visible and developed a sudden philosophical objection to obedience when they were not. Samuel called this normal puppy behavior. Daniel called it negotiations with a furry criminal. The training helped both of them.
Penny learned that she could rest without watching Daniel constantly. Daniel learned that Penny could be out of sight without disappearing from his life. When his thoughts became crowded, he still found comfort in her warm weight beside his chair. But he also called Beth, Laura, Samuel, or Owen. Penny remained a bridge. She was no longer the entire road. The porch light circle changed as well. Maggie's fall had exposed the danger of building a community around one person's strength. Daniel understood that better than anyone. A system that depended upon a single person remaining unbreakable was not a system. It was a delayed failure. Evelyn Carter volunteered to manage the evening telephone calls. With her hearing aid secured by a new clip and her television remote restored, Evelyn approached the assignment like the director of a small intelligence agency. Anyone who failed to answer received 2 additional calls, 1 message, and if necessary, a complaint about their manners. Ruth Walker coordinated the visiting schedule using a wall calendar covered in colored marks. Her years as a hospital receptionist made her excellent at remembering appointments, though she still gave Daniel instructions after he had completed the task. Emma created a simple check-in system that could be used on a phone, tablet, or printed sheet. Green meant safe. Yellow meant call again. Red meant send someone to the house. She trained retired neighbors and high school volunteers with the patient authority of someone who had long ago accepted that adults occasionally required supervision. Beth organized grocery deliveries. Helen Morris checked basic first aid supplies. June Whitaker became responsible for what she called morale, which appeared to involve distributing cookies whether anyone requested them or not. Several veterans from Daniel's group volunteered for household repairs. Local students shoveled walkways. Retired teachers made afternoon calls. Widows who had once waited alone for the telephone began calling others. Daniel still carried Maggie's notebook, but he no longer carried the entire responsibility. The morning Maggie was discharged, snow covered Maple Street in a clean, white layer. Claire Donnelly accompanied her in a hospital transport van, while Daniel and Beth waited near the blue-doored house. Maggie wore a deep purple wool coat, her white hair neatly combed beneath a gray hat. Her face remained thinner than before the fall, but color had returned to her cheeks. A polished wooden cane rested beside her, though Maggie regarded it with the suspicious expression of a woman forced to travel with an unwanted relative. As the van turned onto Maple Street, the first porch light came on, then the second. One by one, lamps brightened through the snowfall. Warm circles of gold appeared above doors and along shallow steps. Evelyn stood behind her window and waved both arms. Ruth waited beside her gate, holding the schedule calendar as though it were a flag.
Helen stood straight beneath her porch roof. Chewin scattered crumbs for birds despite being told not to attract them near the newly cleared walkway. 11 lights glowed along the street. Maggie looked toward her own house. The porch remained dark. Her expression changed. For a moment, Daniel saw the fear she had carried in the hospital, the fear that the circle had learned to continue without her because it no longer needed her at all. Daniel opened the van door. There's one more. He lifted Penny from the back seat. The German Shepherd puppy had grown stronger, with a healthy shine returning to her black and tan coat. Both ears now stood upright most of the time, though one still tilted when she became curious. A purple ribbon circled her temporary collar. Daniel carried Penny to the bottom step and set her down beside a newly installed switch mounted low against the porch post. During training, Samuel had helped Penny learn to press it with her nose. "Light," Daniel said. Penny looked at the switch, then at Daniel. Snow rested along her muzzle. She leaned forward and nudged the plate. The 12th porch light came alive. Applause rose from both sides of Maple Street. Maggie laughed, then covered her mouth as tears filled her pale blue eyes. Daniel helped her climb the repaired steps, one careful pace at a time. Inside, the strengthened handrail held firm beneath her hand. Maggie lowered herself onto the top step. Her lavender gloves rested across her knees. Penny ran toward her, tail moving so quickly that her entire body swayed. Maggie opened her arms, expecting the puppy to settle at her feet as she once had outside the market. But Penny paused. She turned and looked back at Daniel.
Daniel stood near the gate, snow collecting on the shoulders of his coat. He understood the question in her gaze and crossed the short distance. When he bent beside Maggie, Penny stepped between them.
There, beneath the 12th light, stood the little dog between the two people who had once saved her. One who had given her food, and one who had given her a home. Spring came quietly to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, loosening winter one roof at a time. Snow vanished from the shaded alleys, maple buds opened along the sidewalks, and rain washed the soot from the old red brick buildings until the city seemed to breathe more easily. Penny was nearly 7 months old now. The once fragile German Shepherd puppy had grown into a graceful young dog with long legs, a healthy black and tan coat, and 2 alert ears that stood proudly, except when curiosity tilted the left one sideways. The copper-colored patch on her front paw remained, bright as the small coin that had given her a name. Penny still stole gloves when opportunity presented itself, but Samuel Reed had helped Daniel channel her curiosity into calmer work. Twice each week, Penny attended a supervised visiting dog program at a senior living center. She was learning to wait beside wheelchairs, accept gentle hands without jumping, and remain still when residents moved slowly or spoke loudly. Penny was not yet certified, and Daniel refused to rush her. Samuel often reminded him that good service began with allowing a dog to remain a dog. Penny seemed to agree. She worked patiently for 20 minutes, then attempted to carry away a slipper belonging to a 90-year-old resident who laughed so hard that a nurse had to retrieve both the shoe and her dignity. Daniel Harper's father's workshop had also changed. The weathered building now carried a modest wooden sign painted by Emma, Porch Light Workshop. The letters were slightly uneven, because Emma insisted handmade things should be permitted to look handmade. The workshop was not a business in the usual sense. No polished receptionist sat at the front desk, and no one could explain why the coffee machine produced something that tasted faintly of wood stain. Veterans, retired tradesmen, high school volunteers, and neighbors gathered there to repair loose handrails, sticking doors, porch lamps, shelves, ramps, and small pieces of furniture for older residents living alone. Daniel kept a notebook of requests on the same bench where his father had once measured cabinet doors. Owen Price repaired metal brackets with the steady hands of a former medic who approached every damaged hinge as if it were a patient refusing sensible treatment. Beth organized deliveries on Saturday mornings, while Emma maintained the schedule and corrected adults who forgot to mark completed jobs. Penny occupied a square mat beside Daniel's walnut toolbox, at least until an unattended glove or sandwich wrapper drew her into a separate investigation. The work did not make Daniel's life perfect. Some nights he still woke before dawn with his heart pounding. Some mornings he sat in his truck outside the workshop, unable to make himself open the door. In the past, he would have waited until the feeling passed and then told everyone he had been delayed by traffic. Now he sometimes called Owen and admitted, "Today is difficult." Owen usually replied with something unhelpful but honest, such as, "Then bring the difficult day inside. We have a railing due by noon." Daniel also continued therapy and attended the veterans group. He had learned that recovery was not a straight road leading away from pain. It was a wider road on which pain no longer occupied every lane. Penny helped him walk it, but she did not carry him. Beth helped. Owen helped. Laura, Samuel, Maggie, Ruth, Evelyn, Helen, June, Emma, and the noisy workshop helped. Most importantly, Daniel had stopped treating his own need as evidence of failure. Maggie Collins had recovered enough to walk Maple Street with a cane she still described as an insult with a rubber foot. Her chin-length white hair remained carefully arranged, and her lavender gloves appeared even on mornings warm enough that no one else wore gloves at all. Maggie no longer coordinated every detail of the Porch Light Circle. Instead, she became its storyteller. At community meetings, she stood before widows, veterans, students, nurses, shopkeepers, and retirees, and told them how a dark porch, a waiting puppy, and one unanswered telephone had revealed the weakness in their old system. The circle was not saved by a soldier.
Maggie always said. And it was not saved by a dog. It was saved by a chain of people who decided not to walk past someone else's loneliness. Penny usually lay beside the podium during these speeches. At the word dog, she lifted her head as though preparing to accept full credit. Maggie never corrected her. Daniel was no longer the reluctant guest who arrived late for family dinners and left before dessert. On Sundays, he reached Beth's house early with fresh bread under one arm and Penny's leash in the other hand. He helped Emma with small woodworking projects, complained about Beth's habit of overcooking vegetables, and stayed long enough to wash dishes. Penny developed a talent for removing napkins from people's laps with such care that victims often did not notice until the cloth had disappeared beneath the table. Beth called it theft. Emma called it advanced stealth. Daniel called it another reason not to leave roast chicken unattended. One mild Saturday morning, Daniel took Penny back to Lancaster Central Market. He had avoided the exact corner where he found her, not from fear, but because the memory still seemed delicate, like something that might tear if handled too often. The pavement was dry now. Flower vendors had replaced winter wreaths with buckets of tulips, and the air carried the sense of coffee, fresh bread, damp soil, and cinnamon. Where the white foam takeout container had once rested, a chalkboard sign now advertised strawberries. No one passing the spot would have known that a small animal had once waited there for 3 cold mornings, listening for lavender-gloved hands. A local rescue group had set up an adoption event near the market entrance. Folding pens held several dogs beneath bright fabric banners. Volunteers spoke with families, answered questions, and handed out printed care guides. One of the volunteers was Ana Ruiz, a 63-year-old retired librarian with a short, sturdy figure, warm olive skin, silver-streaked dark hair cut just below her ears, and calm brown eyes. Ana had spent most of her life helping hesitant people approach unfamiliar books. Retirement had taught her that frightened animals often required the same patience. She recognized Penny from Laura's clinic and greeted Daniel without reaching toward the dog too quickly. "There is someone here who has not decided whether people are worth the trouble," Anna said. In the last pen sat a small mixed-breed puppy with cream-colored fur, oversized brown ears, and a narrow white stripe between frightened black eyes. The puppy crouched in the far corner while visitors passed, shrinking each time a child shouted or a metal bowl moved across the ground. Anna explained that the puppy had been found beneath an abandoned porch and had eaten only when everyone left the room. Daniel did not ask Penny to perform. He simply loosened the leash. Penny approached the pen slowly. The cream-colored puppy pressed farther into the corner. Penny stopped before reaching the bars, turned sideways to appear less threatening, and lowered herself onto the pavement. She did not bark. She did not paw at the gate or demand attention. She rested her head between her front paws and remained still while the market moved around them. Minutes passed. The frightened puppy's ears shifted forward, a small nose lifted. Eventually, the puppy crossed half the pen and lay down facing Penny, leaving several careful feet between them. Anna looked at Daniel. "She knows how to wait." Daniel watched Penny's copper-marked paw resting on the pavement. Someone taught her. On the drive home, Penny slept across the back seat, tired from doing almost nothing. Daniel passed the market corner again and realized the old foam box had been gone for months. Penny did not rise or look back. She no longer needed to search for it. The box had never been a home. It had only been a place where a promise waited to be found. A true home was not merely shelter from cold, rain, or darkness. It was a place where a light remained on, so anyone returning from the long road would know that somewhere, someone was still waiting. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive with thunder, signs, or answers we can immediately understand. Sometimes they arrive shivering inside a discarded box, carrying nothing but trust and the courage to wait. Penny did not erase Daniel's pain. She gave him a reason to stop hiding from it. Daniel did not save an entire community alone. He simply chose not to walk past one vulnerable life.
and that choice became the first link in a chain of mercy. That is the lesson worth carrying into ordinary life. We may never know how much a phone call, an open door, a repaired railing, or a few quiet minutes of companionship can mean to someone who feels forgotten. From a human point of view, the greatest miracle was not that Penny found a home. It was that people began noticing one another again. Perhaps God often works that way, placing small lives in our path and asking whether we will pause long enough to see them. Share this story with someone who may need its message. Tell us in the comments what Penny's journey meant to you, and subscribe for more stories of hope, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, and keep a light burning for you, wherever life may lead.